California Territory, 1849. A time when gold fever transformed ordinary people into desperate fortune seekers, when the promise of instant wealth shattered moral boundaries, and when a person's value was measured by what they could contribute. To the dream of striking it rich. For Rebecca Harlow, the journey west represented hope for a new beginning, away from the scandal that followed an unmarried woman with child. But in a land where gold outweighed humanity, some were deemed expendable when resources grew scarce and the path became treacherous. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first rays of dawn filtered through the towering pines, casting long shadows across the abandoned campsite. Rebecca Harlow moved methodically among the remnants, gathering what little had been left behind in the Sawyer wagon party's hasty departure. A dented tin cup, a frayed blanket too worn to be worth taking, a small sack of cornmeal overlooked in the darkness, meager findings that might extend her survival by a day or two at most. 6 months pregnant and alone in the Sierra Nevada, Rebecca fought against the tears that threatened to overcome her composure. Crying would solve nothing. Crying wouldn't bring back the wagon train that had slipped away in the night, wouldn't ease the ache in her swollen feet, wouldn't quiet the hunger that gnawed at her insides. "We're better off without her," she had overheard Henry Sawyer tell the others the previous evening. "Another mouth to feed, and she'll only slow us down when the snows come. The mountain pass is narrow enough without dragging along a woman who'll likely birth her bastard before we reach the goldfields." No one had defended her. Not even the Reverend Parker and his wife, who had welcomed Rebecca to join their wagon train back in St. Louis with such Christian charity. Their silence had spoken volumes when Sawyer suggested leaving her behind. Rebecca's hand moved protectively to her swollen belly, feeling the gentle movement within. The child of William Bennett, son of Boston's most prominent banker, a man who had promised love and marriage until learning of her condition, then denied ever knowing her in a biblical sense. "We have to be practical," Martha Sawyer had rationalized as the group packed by moonlight. "Winter comes early to these mountains. The Donner Party wasn't the first to get trapped, and they won't be the last. Better to sacrifice one than doom." As all, they had left her sleeping, or so they thought. Rebecca had been awake, frozen in disbelief as they hitched their oxen and loaded their wagons with practiced quiet. They had taken most of the communal supplies, provisions purchased, with pooled money that included Rebecca's last savings. Only her personal trunk remained, containing clothing unsuitable for the wilderness and keepsakes with no survival value. Now, as full daylight revealed the magnitude of her predicament, Rebecca forced herself to think practically. The Sawyer party had been following a crude map toward Johnson's Pass, still at least a week's journey ahead. Beyond that lay the promised goldfields of California, where she had planned to find work as a seamstress or cook in one of the booming mining towns. Without a wagon or supplies, continuing on the same path was suicide. Turning back meant attempting to cross hundreds of miles of territory alone, equally impossible in her condition. Rebecca sat heavily on her trunk, the weight of her situation pressing down upon her shoulders with crushing force. A rustle in the underbrush sent her scrambling for the small knife she kept in her boot, her only weapon. A deer emerged, regarding her with liquid eyes before bounding away, startled by her sudden movement. Rebecca's racing heart slowed, but the moment of fear crystallized her thinking. She couldn't remain at the abandoned campsite. Predators, both animal and human, would be drawn to its remains. With painful deliberation, Rebecca emptied her trunk, sorting through her belongings with ruthless practicality. The heavy dresses stayed behind, as did the books and the porcelain figurine her mother had given her. She tore one dress into strips for bandages and possible use as cordage. Another she modified hastily with her sewing kit, creating a more practical garment for walking. Her father's old hunting knife, brought along for sentimentality rather than practical use, now became her most valuable possession. By midday, Rebecca had fashioned a small bundle containing everything of use: the Egypt knife, the sewing kit, the cornmeal, a small pot abandoned as too dented to cook with properly, the blanket, flint and steel for fire-making, and a few personal items she couldn't bear to leave behind: her mother's silver locket and the small baby gown she had sewn during evenings around the campfire. The September sun beat down upon the mountain slopes with surprising intensity for the season, but Rebecca knew the warmth was deceptive. Nights in the high country already carried the bite of approaching winter, and local Indians had warned of an early snow year. The Sawyer party had been pushing hard to cross Johnson's Pass before the weather turned, their urgency contributing to their willingness to abandon what they saw as a liability. Rebecca studied the crude map she had copied from Henry Sawyer's original weeks earlier, an insurance against exactly this type of betrayal. There was a trading post marked approximately 3 days south of Johnson's Pass. Mackenzie's Outpost, it was called. If she could reach it, perhaps she might find help there, or at least shelter, until she determined her next move. The journey would be arduous, made more so by her pregnancy and limited supplies, but it represented her only realistic hope. With grim determination, Rebecca shouldered her modest bundle and set out along the faint trail, leaving behind the remnants of shattered trust. By late afternoon, Rebecca had made disappointing progress. The path was steeper than anticipated, frequently obstructed by fallen trees and rocky outcroppings that forced time-consuming detours. Her pregnancy altered her balance, making the uneven terrain treacherous. Twice she had nearly fallen, saved only by grabbing onto nearby branches. A stream provided fresh water, which she collected in the dented pot to carry with her. She found wild blackberries growing in a sunny clearing and devoured them gratefully, the tart sweetness momentarily distracting from her exhaustion. But as shadows lengthened across the mountainside, anxiety tightened its grip around her heart. She needed to find shelter before nightfall. The first drops of rain struck without warning, rapidly intensifying into a mountain downpour that soaked Rebecca to the skin within minutes. The temperature plummeted with the storm's arrival, and her fingers quickly grew numb as she struggled to keep her footing on the now slippery path. Her modified dress, practical just hours ago, now clung to her body. Waterlogged and heavy, lightning flashed overhead, followed by a thunderclap so loud it seemed to shake the mountainside. Rebecca instinctively ducked, then forced herself forward. Standing exposed during a lightning storm would be fatal. She needed cover, and quickly. The trail ahead disappeared into a wall of grey rain. Rebecca pushed onward, one hand shielding her eyes from the downpour, the other pressed protectively against her belly. Her foot caught on an exposed root, invisible in the gathering gloom, sending her sprawling forward onto the muddy ground. Pain shot through her ankle as she attempted to stand. Not broken, she thought with relief, but definitely sprained. Rebecca struggled upright, testing her weight gingerly on the injured joint. She could walk, but barely, each step sending jolts of pain up her leg. Night was approaching rapidly, the storm having prematurely darkened the sky. With growing desperation, Rebecca limped forward, searching for any natural shelter, a cave, an overhang, even a cluster of densely grown trees might offer some protection from the elements. Instead, the trail grew steeper, more exposed. The wind intensified, driving the rain sideways with stinging force. Rebecca's pace slowed to a painful crawl, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she fought against the twin obstacles of terrain and weather. A particularly vicious gust nearly knocked her from her feet. As she struggled to maintain her balance, Rebecca's gaze caught something through the curtain of rain, a flicker of light in the distance, steady and unwavering, unlike lightning. A fire. Shelter. Hope surged through her, providing renewed strength. Rebecca altered her course toward the light, abandoning the trail to cut directly through the forest. The going was harder here, the underbrush thick and tangled, but the promise of fire and potential help drove her forward despite the pain in her ankle and the exhaustion weighing down her limbs. The light disappeared behind a ridge, then reappeared closer now. Rebecca could make out the dim outline of what appeared to be a cabin, smoke rising from its stone chimney despite the downpour. A dog barked, having caught her scent on the wind. 20 yards from the cabin, Rebecca's strength finally gave out. Her injured ankle buckled beneath her, sending her once more to the ground. This time, she couldn't rise, her body betraying her after being pushed beyond endurance. The child within her stirred restlessly, as if sensing her distress. "Please," she whispered, though there was no one to hear. "Please, help us." The cabin door swung open, spilling golden lamplight across the rain-soaked clearing. A massive figure filled the doorway, silhouetted against the warm glow behind him. The barking dog circled excitedly around his master's legs, still alerting to the stranger's presence. "Who's out there?" a deep voice called, wary but not immediately hostile. "Show yourself!" Rebecca tried to respond, but her voice failed her, emerging as little more than a whimper. She attempted to raise herself, to become visible in the darkness, but her arms trembled and gave way beneath her. The man raised a lantern, its light cutting through the rain and darkness. For a moment, Rebecca saw him clearly, tall and broad-shouldered, with a full beard and hair that hung past his shoulders. He wore buckskins and carried a rifle in his free hand. A mountain man, one of those legendary figures who lived in the wilderness year-round, trapping and trading far from civilization. His eyes found her then, crumpled on the ground at the edge of his clearing. The wariness in his expression gave way to surprise, then concern. "Good Lord," he muttered, setting down the lantern and rifle and striding toward her through the rain. "What in heaven's name?" Rebecca's vision blurred, exhaustion finally claiming her as the mountain man reached her side. The last thing she registered was the surprising gentleness of his weathered hands as he checked her for injuries and his sharp intake of breath when he realized her condition. "You're safe now," she thought she heard him say as consciousness slipped away. "You both are." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Warmth was the first sensation Rebecca registered as consciousness slowly returned. Warmth and the crackling of a well-maintained fire. She lay on something soft, far softer than the rocky ground where she had collapsed, covered by thick furs that retained heat like nothing she'd experienced on the long journey west. Her eyes fluttered open to a rough-hewn timber ceiling. A cabin. Not a tent, not the exposed wilderness, but a solid structure that held the howling mountain storm at bay. Outside, rain lashed against small glass windows, distorting the view beyond into watery smears of darkness and distant lightning. Rebecca attempted to sit up, triggering a sharp pain in her ankle. The movement caught the attention of the cabin's occupant, who rose from a chair by the fire and approached with measured steps. "Easy now," the mountain man said, his voice lower and gentler than it had been in the clearing. "That ankle needs rest." Up close, he was even more imposing, standing well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders broadened by years of wilderness living. His beard, streaked with early grey despite his apparent youth, couldn't hide the strong jawline beneath, but it was his eyes that caught Rebecca's attention, clear blue, intelligent, and currently assessing her with a mixture of concern and cautious curiosity. "Where am I?" Rebecca managed, her voice hoarse from exhaustion. "My cabin!" He gestured around the small but surprisingly well-organized space. "Name's Jeremiah Blackwood. Most folks just call me Blackwood." He poured water from a kettle into a cup and offered it to her. "And you're lucky my hunting dog's got a good nose. or you'd still be out there in that deluge." Rebecca accepted the water gratefully, the cool liquid soothing her parched throat. "Rebecca Harlow," she replied. "Thank you for—" she faltered, the enormity of her situation washing over her. "For saving us." Blackwood's eyes flickered briefly to her swollen belly at the us, but he made no comment on her condition. Instead, he moved to a pot hanging over the fire, stirring its contents, before ladling a portion into a wooden bowl. "Venison stew," he explained, bringing it to her. "Nothing fancy, but it'll put strength back in you. When's the last time you ate something proper?" The question brought a fresh wave of humiliation, memories of the Sawyer parties increasing. Resentment at feeding an extra mouth in the days before they abandoned her. "Yesterday morning," she admitted, "some hardtack and jerky." Blackwood's expression darkened, but he said nothing as Rebecca began to eat. The stew was simple but delicious. Chunks of venison with wild onions and some kind of mountain tubers she didn't recognize. She forced herself to eat slowly despite her hunger, mindful of her body's needs and the child within. As she ate, Rebecca took in her surroundings more carefully. The cabin was small but remarkably civilized for such a remote location. Shelves lined one wall, stocked with provisions, books, and various tools. Furs and hand-woven blankets created comfortable seating areas. Dried herbs hung from the rafters, filling the air with an earthy, pleasant aroma. A large golden retriever lay by the fire, watching her with curious eyes while occasionally thumping its tail against the floorboards. "That's Buck," Blackwood said, noticing her gaze. "He's the one found you." Rebecca offered a small smile toward the dog. "Thank you, Buck." The mundane exchange only delayed the inevitable questions. Blackwood pulled his chair closer, his expression serious but not unkind. "I've tended that ankle. Nothing broken but a bad sprain. Wrapped it tight with yarrow poultice to take down the swelling." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Now, I don't mean to pry into business that ain't mine, but a woman in your condition, alone in these mountains with a storm coming in, that ain't natural circumstances." Rebecca looked down at her empty bowl, debating how much to reveal. This stranger had saved her life, possibly her child's as well, yet years of enduring judgmental stares had taught her caution. "I was traveling with the Sawyer wagon party," she began slowly, "heading to the goldfields, not for gold, but for work. There's good money to be made sewing and cooking for miners, with more dust than sense." Blackwood nodded. "Seen plenty pass through, headed that way. Most don't know what they're getting into." The Sawyers. They decided I was slowing them down. The humiliation burned fresh as she spoke the words. "They left during the night, took most of the supplies." Blackwood's hands tightened on his knees, knuckles whitening. "They abandoned a pregnant woman in mountain country with winter coming." His voice remained steady, but a muscle twitched in his jaw. "Even among gold-crazed fools, that's a special kind of wickedness." "They were afraid," Rebecca said, surprising herself by offering any defense of their actions. "The passes will snow over soon. They didn't want to end up like the Donner Party." "So they left you to die instead." Oh, it wasn't a question, and the matter-of-fact way he stated it stripped away any pretense that the Sawyers' decision had been anything but a death sentence. Outside, thunder rumbled across the mountains, and the rain intensified. Buck whined softly, moving closer to the fire. "Smart choice, bringing him in," Blackwood said, nodding toward the dog. "This storm's got staying power, 3 days, maybe 4, before it blows over." He rose and added another log to the fire. "Which gives that ankle time to heal some before we figure out your next steps." The casual mention of "we," the assumption that her predicament was now a shared concern rather than hers alone, brought unexpected tears to Rebecca's eyes. She blinked them away quickly, unwilling to appear more vulnerable than she already was. "I was trying to reach Mackenzie's outpost," she explained. "It was marked on the map, about 3 days south of Johnson's Pass." Blackwood gave a short, humorless laugh. Mackenzie packed up and headed for the goldfields 6 months ago. Nothing there now but an empty cabin and maybe some rats. He shook his head. Maps outdated. Gold fever's changed this territory faster than anyone can keep track. Rebecca's fragile hope crumbled. Then there's nowhere— Didn't say that, Blackwood interrupted. Salem's Crossing is 5 days west of here. Small settlement, mostly trappers and traders. They've got a proper doctor. Well, mostly proper. Jenkins lost his license back east for drinking, but he's skilled when he's sober, and the town keeps him that way most days. He studied her thoughtfully. How far along are you? 6 months, near as I can reckon. Blackwood nodded, calculating. Something in his head. Baby's due end of December then. Mountain passes will be deep in snow by then. He stroked his beard absently. You can't winter here alone. Not enough supplies for 2, and you'd need someone who knows mountain medicine when your time comes. I don't expect— Rebecca began, but Blackwood waved away her protest. Salem's Crossing is your best hope. They're decent folk mostly. Got a widow there, Martha Wilson, who takes in boarders. She might have work for you, too. He glanced out the window at the worsening storm. But that's talk for after this weather breaks. Rebecca felt the weight of her circumstances pressing down again. Even with a destination in mind, the journey would be arduous in her condition, and what awaited her there— more judgment, more rejection. Blackwood seemed to read her thoughts. Mountain folk are different from those gold-crazed pilgrims, he said quietly. Out here, helping each other isn't charity, it's survival. Nobody makes it alone. He stood and moved toward a chest in the corner, retrieving a small leather-bound book. Rest now. Storm's going nowhere tonight, and neither are we. He handed her the book, a well-worn copy of Wordsworth's poems. Surprised? Thought mountain men couldn't read? A smile tugged at Rebecca's lips, despite everything. Perhaps I was. 7 years at Princeton before I decided civilization wasn't to my taste. He shrugged, as if this revelation was of no consequence. The mountains teach different lessons, but I didn't see the need to leave all civilization behind. As Blackwood busied himself preparing a pallet on the floor, clearly intending to give her the cabin's only bed, Rebecca studied him with new eyes. This man was neither the uncouth savage that Eastern newspapers portrayed mountain men to be, nor a failed prospector-turned-wilderness dweller. He had chosen this life with its hardships and solitude. Why? She asked suddenly. Why help a stranger who brings nothing but trouble to your door? Blackwood paused in his work, considering the question with the same deliberation he seemed to apply to everything. My mother traveled west when I was a boy, he said finally. She was alone after my father died of cholera near Fort Laramie. A Shoshone family found us half-starved in the mountains. He glanced at Rebecca, his eyes reflecting the firelight. They could have passed us by, would have been easier. Instead, they shared what little they had until we could fend for ourselves. He returned to arranging his sleeping area. Some debts can't be repaid to those who owed them, can only be passed forward. The simplicity of his philosophy struck Rebecca deeply. In a territory where gold had transformed ordinary people into something unrecognizable, where greed made monsters of former friends, this solitary man maintained a moral compass that many church-going folks had abandoned. As exhaustion began to claim her once more, Rebecca watched Blackwood move about the cabin with quiet efficiency, securing it against the raging storm. For the first time since discovering herself abandoned, she allowed herself to feel something beyond fear and desperation. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps its distant cousin, possibility. For 3 days, the mountain storm raged without respite. Wind howled through the pine forests, rain lashed against the cabin's sturdy walls, and occasional thunder shook the very ground beneath them. Inside Blackwood's shelter, Rebecca experienced a strange interlude. Removed from the journey that had consumed her life for months, yet keenly aware that this pause was merely temporary. By the second day, fever gripped her. The The combination of exposure, exhaustion, and strain had weakened her body's defenses. Rebecca drifted in and out of consciousness, fragments of delirious dreams mixing with hazy moments of clarity. Through it all, she was vaguely aware of Blackwood's constant, steady presence, his calloused hands pressing cool cloths to her forehead, helping her drink bitter-tasting herbal teas, speaking in low, reassuring tones when nightmares caused her to cry out. On the morning of the fourth day, Rebecca woke clear-headed for the first time since falling ill. Pale sunlight filtered through the cabin windows, indicating the storm had finally broken. She found herself alone in the cabin, though the freshly stoked fire and steaming pot of something fragrant hanging above it suggested Blackwood hadn't gone far. Testing her strength, Rebecca pushed herself upright. Her body felt weak, but no longer. Consumed by fever, the child within her stirred with reassuring movement. She swung her legs carefully over the edge of the bed, mindful of her injured ankle, and was pleasantly surprised to find the swelling had subsided considerably. The cabin door swung open, bringing with it a gust of crisp mountain air. Blackwood entered carrying an armful of firewood, Buck trotting happily at his heels. Both man and dog were damp from the lingering rain, though the downpour had clearly abated. "You're awake," Blackwood observed, setting down the wood with characteristic efficiency, "and looking better. Fever broke during the night." "Thanks to your care," Rebecca acknowledged, feeling oddly shy in the face of how completely this stranger had tended to her during her illness. "I don't remember much, but I know you hardly left my side." Blackwood shrugged, uncomfortable with the gratitude. Mountain fever can take a person quick if it's not watched, especially one in your condition. He moved to the pot hanging over the fire. "Feeling up to some breakfast? Made pine needle tea, good for what ails you, and there's cornmeal mush with dried berries." The simple meal tasted better than any feast Rebecca had enjoyed in Boston society. Perhaps it was her recovery, or maybe the mountain air, but the flavors seemed more vibrant, the satisfaction deeper. As she ate, Blackwood studied a crude map, spread on the table, occasionally making marks with a piece of charcoal. "Planning our route to Salem's Crossing," he explained when he caught her watching. "Storms change things. There'll be washouts on the main trail, probably a rock slide, or two in the narrow passes. Our route?" Rebecca questioned, surprised by his apparent decision to accompany her. Blackwood looked up, his expression suggesting the answer was obvious. "You didn't think I'd point you in the right direction and wish you luck, did you? 5 days of hard, traveling for a healthy man, in your condition, with winter closing in." He shook his head. "Besides, these mountains get dangerous after a big storm. Trail markers washed away, new hazards to navigate." Rebecca felt a mixture of relief and discomfort. Relief at not facing the journey alone, discomfort at being further indebted to this man who owed her nothing. "I have no way to repay you," she said quietly, voicing the concern that weighed on her. "No money, nothing of value." Blackwood's weather-worn face softened slightly. "Not everything in this world has a price tag, Miss Harlow." He tapped the map decisively. "We leave tomorrow at first light. Today, you rest and regain your strength. I'll prepare supplies." The day passed in peaceful industry. While Rebecca remained largely confined to the bed or chair by the fire, she insisted on contributing what she could, mending a torn shirt of Blackwood's with neat, practiced stitches, helping prepare dried foods for the journey, even sorting through her own meager possessions to determine what was essential for the trek ahead. As evening approached, Blackwood returned from checking his traps with a brace of rabbits. Rebecca watched with quiet appreciation as he prepared them for cooking, his movements economical and practiced. There was a deliberate quality to everything the mountain man did. No wasted motion, no unnecessary flourish. It spoke of a life where efficiency wasn't merely virtuous but essential for survival. "May I ask you something?" Rebecca ventured, as Blackwood put the rabbit stew onto simmer. When he nodded, she continued, You mentioned Princeton, a life before the mountains. What brought you here to such solitude? Blackwood was silent for a long moment, and Rebecca wondered if she'd overstepped. Finally, he settled into the chair opposite hers, his large frame making the hand-carved furniture seem almost dainty. "War changes men," he said simply. "I fought for the Union, saw things no man should see, did things no man should have to do." His gaze drifted to the window, where the last light of day painted the mountains in gold and crimson. When it ended, cities felt crowded. Too many people, too much noise. Every loud sound sent me back to the battlefield. He absently stroked Buck's head as the dog settled at his feet. "Came west with a surveying party in '66. First time I set foot in these mountains, something shifted inside me. The silence, the scale of things, makes a man's troubles seem smaller somehow." Rebecca understood more than he might have expected. "My father returned from that war a different man as well. The spark gone from his eyes, replaced by shadows that never quite faded." Blackwood nodded, a moment of recognition passing between them. "Your father still living?" "No. Pneumonia took him last winter." She paused, then added quietly, "His passing is what set me on this path west. There was nothing left for me in Boston after the child's father abandoned his responsibilities," Blackwood finished matter-of-factly, not a question but a statement. When Rebecca looked startled, he added, "Not my first season watching the world turn, Miss Harlow. Your story's not as unusual as you might think." The lack of judgment in his tone loosened something tight in Rebecca's chest. "William Bennett, son of Franklin Bennett, the banker. He promised marriage until I told him about the baby. Then he claimed I'd been with others, that he couldn't be certain." She trailed off, the humiliation still raw despite the months and miles she'd put between herself and that betrayal. "Man like that isn't worth the ground he walks on," Blackwood said flatly. "Out here, a person's word means something. Break it, and you might not survive the consequences." The simple morality of it struck Rebecca forcefully. In Boston society, William had faced no real consequences for his actions. His family's wealth and position had insulated him completely. She, meanwhile, had lost everything: reputation, security, home. "Is that why you came to the goldfields, to start fresh where no one knows your past?" Blackwood asked. Rebecca smoothed her dress over her swollen belly. "Partly, but also because I heard women can make their own way there. A seamstress can earn more in a month in a mining town than in a year back east. I thought," she smiled ruefully, "I thought I could build something for us, my child and me, something that couldn't be taken away by a man's lies or a society's judgment." Blackwood stirred the stew, considering her words. "There's truth in that. Gold country's raw, but it respects grit and honest work. Man can arrive with nothing but the shirt on his back and make something of himself. I imagine the same applies to a woman of determination." The simple confidence in his assessment, not pity, not condescension, but a straightforward acknowledgement of her capability, felt like a balm to wounds Rebecca hadn't realized were still so tender. "Tomorrow we start for Salem's Crossing," Blackwood continued, ladling stew into bowls. "From there you can decide your path. The passes to the goldfields will close soon with the snows. But come spring, if that's still your aim, the route will open again." As they ate, Rebecca found herself studying her rescuer more carefully. Beneath the beard and weather-roughened exterior was a man of complexity she hadn't initially appreciated. Educated, but unbound by convention. Solitary, but not truly a hermit. Hard in the way the mountains themselves were hard, not from cruelty, but from the necessities of survival. "What will you do?" she asked suddenly. "After delivering me to Salem's Crossing?" Blackwood looked momentarily surprised by the question, as if his own future movements were so routine they hardly warranted consideration. "Return here. Prepare. And for winter. The trapping's good once snow sets in. Beaver, fox, maybe some marten if I'm lucky. He gestured vaguely toward the shelves stocked with provisions. "Got enough to see me through till spring, then I'll take the furs to trade when the pass is clear." The simplicity of it highlighted how complicated Rebecca's own path had become. No clear destination, no certainty beyond the immediate future, every step contingent on factors beyond her control. As if sensing her thoughts, Blackwood added, "Life doesn't always follow the trails we mark on our maps, Miss Harlow. Sometimes the path disappears altogether, and we have to find our way by other means." Outside, the last light faded from the sky, revealing a canopy of stars so brilliant they seemed to illuminate the mountains with silver fire. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the continuation of a journey with no clear end. But tonight, in this cabin that had become an unexpected sanctuary, Rebecca allowed herself to acknowledge how far she'd already come. Not just in miles, but in understanding what she was truly capable of enduring. And perhaps, though she was not yet ready, to name it even to herself, what she might be capable of building once the storm had fully passed. Dawn broke crisp and clear over the mountains, painting the snow-capped peaks with rose-gold light. Rebecca stood outside Blackwood's cabin, breathing deeply of the pine-scented air while he made final preparations for their journey. After days confined indoors, the vastness of the landscape struck her anew, majestic, beautiful, and utterly indifferent to human concerns. Blackwood emerged from the cabin leading a sturdy mountain pony laden with supplies. Buck circled excitedly, sensing the imminent departure. "Not much to look at," Blackwood said, patting the pony's neck. "But Penny here knows these mountains better than most men. Sure-footed on trails that would make a mule think twice." Rebecca eyed the small horse dubiously. "Will she carry both?" "Of course, she won't need to. You'll ride, I'll walk." When Rebecca began to protest, Blackwood raised a hand to forestall her objections. 5 days' journey for a healthy man is 7 or 8 for a pregnant woman on foot. We don't have that kind of time before the weather turns. His practicality was unanswerable. Rebecca allowed him to help her mount, settling awkwardly into the makeshift saddle, little more than a folded blanket secured with leather straps. Her ankle, while improved, still throbbed dully when she put weight on it. "The trail drops down to Carson Creek," Blackwood explained, shouldering his rifle and taking Penny's lead rope. "We'll follow it west for 2 days, then cut north through Miller's Pass, assuming the pass is still open." "And if it isn't?" Rebecca asked, adjusting her shawl against the morning chill. Blackwood's expression remained impassive. "Then we take the long way round. Adds 3 days, but it's safer." With that less than reassuring assessment, they set off. Buck took point, trotting ahead with occasional backward glances to ensure his humans were following. Blackwood led Penny at a steady pace, choosing each step with deliberate care on the trail that was little more than a game path in places. The route initially descended through thick pine forest. Fallen trees and debris from the storm frequently obstructed the path, forcing detours that Blackwood navigated with the confidence of one who read the land as easily as others might read a book. By midday, they had reached Carson Creek. Now, a rushing torrent swollen by the recent rains. "Normally we'd cross here," Blackwood said, eyeing the churning water with a frown. "Creeks usually knee-deep at most. Now," he shook his head, "we'll follow it downstream. There's a beaver dam about 2 miles on that might give us a crossing." The delay was frustrating but unavoidable. As they traveled alongside the creek, Rebecca took in details of the wilderness she'd previously been too frightened or exhausted to notice. The varied textures of moss clinging to north-facing rocks, the darting movements of small creatures in the underbrush, the changing character of the forest as they gradually lost elevation. "You read this land well," she observed, as Blackwood identified a bear's claw marks on a tree trunk, explaining they were old enough not to be concerning. "How long did it take to learn?" "Still learning," he replied. Mountains change with the seasons with each storm. Man who thinks he knows everything about them is usually the man who doesn't live to tell about it. He glanced back at her. But, to answer your question, been up here full-time about 3 years. Before that, seasonal. Trips with old Garrity, trapper who taught me the basics. Is he still in these parts? A shadow crossed Blackwood's face. Avalanche took him winter before last. Found him and his cabin both come spring thaw. Mother Nature doesn't play favorites. The stark reminder of the wilderness's dangers sobered Rebecca. For all Blackwood's skill and knowledge, they remained vulnerable to forces beyond human control or prediction. The Sawyer party's fear suddenly seemed less unreasonable, though their response to it, abandoning her, remained unforgivable. By late afternoon they reached the beaver dam Blackwood had mentioned. The impressive structure stretched across a wider, calmer section of the creek, creating a series of pools and channels that offered a potential, if precarious, crossing. "Wait here," Blackwood instructed, handing Penny's lead to Rebecca.
It's at of branches and mud, occasionally using his walking stick to probe for wicks. No, he called back after he...
"Come back for you. Too risky in your condition." Rebecca didn't argue. She watched as Blackwood retraced his steps, his movements calculated and precise. Upon reaching her, he helped her dismount, then led Penny across first, the pony picking her way across the dam with surprising delicacy for such a sturdy animal. "Now us," he said, returning once more. "Step exactly where I step. Hold my hand. And the walking stick for balance." The crossing was nerve-wracking. Twice, Rebecca's foot slipped on the damp wood, Blackwood's strong grip on her arm the only thing preventing a dangerous fall into the rushing water below. By the time they reached the opposite bank, her heart was pounding and her legs trembling. "With tension, you did well," Blackwood said simply, helping her remount Penny. "Most city folk would have frozen halfway across." The unexpected compliment warmed Rebecca more than it should have. "Perhaps I'm not entirely city folk anymore," she replied. "Not after everything." Blackwood studied her with those assessing blue eyes. "Perhaps not," he agreed. They made camp that evening in a small clearing beside the creek. Blackwood efficiently erected a lean-to shelter, built a fire, and prepared a simple meal of jerky, softened in hot water with wild onions. Rebecca contributed by gathering additional firewood from the nearby area, grateful to stretch her legs after hours in the saddle. As darkness fell, the wilderness seemed to close in around their small camp. Nocturnal sounds, the occasional hoot of an owl, the distant howl of wolves, the constant murmur of the creek, created a symphony unlike anything Rebecca had experienced in the East. Staring into the fire, she found herself contemplating how rapidly her life had transformed, how completely her expectations had been upended. "You're quiet," Blackwood observed, feeding another branch to the flames. "Just thinking about paths," she said. 6 months ago, I was planning a wedding to a man I thought loved me. 3 months ago, I was boarding a westbound wagon, desperate to escape scandal. 3 days ago, I was certain I would die alone in these mountains." She looked up at him across the fire. "Nothing has gone as I expected, yet here I am." "Human plans," Blackwood said with a small shrug. "Mountains don't much care for them." "No, I suppose they don't." Rebecca wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly acutely aware of her vulnerability. The Sawyer party should have reached Johnson's Pass by now if they maintained their pace. "Likely," Blackwood agreed. "Too late to catch them, if that's what you're thinking." "It isn't." Rebecca was surprised to realize she spoke the truth. "I have no desire to see them again, except perhaps Henry Sawyer himself, just to show him I survived his callousness." Blackwood prodded the fire thoughtfully. Vengeance is a heavy pack to carry on a long journey. Not vengeance, Rebecca clarified. Vindication. There's a difference. Is there? Blackwood asked, but his tone was curious rather than judgmental. Rebecca considered the question seriously. Vengeance seeks to harm. Vindication seeks to prove worth. She paused. When they left me behind, the message was clear. My life, my child's life, was worth less than their convenience, their gold fever dreams. Surviving despite them. That's its own statement. Blackwood nodded slowly. Fair distinction. He added more wood to the fire. Best get some sleep. Tomorrow will be harder. We start climbing toward Miller's Pass. Rebecca settled into the lean-to, wrapped in the blankets Blackwood had provided. Despite the hard ground beneath her and the unfamiliar sounds surrounding them, she found herself drifting toward sleep with surprising ease. Perhaps it was physical exhaustion, or perhaps something about Blackwood's quiet competence banished immediate fears. Her last conscious thought before sleep claimed her was that the mountain man had not once during their journey asked the question that had dominated her interactions with others since leaving Boston. He had not asked who the father of her child was, had not sought to categorize her within the narrow frameworks of respectable or fallen. In Blackwood's world, she was simply a woman facing difficult circumstances, worthy of assistance, not because of her past or connections, but simply because helping was the right thing to do. It was, she realized, the first time in months she had been treated simply as a person rather than a scandal. Morning arrived with a concerning development. Low clouds hung over the mountains ahead, obscuring the higher peaks entirely. Blackwood studied the weather with a frown as they broke camp. "Storm coming," he announced. "Not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon. Need to push harder than I'd like." The trail steepened as they left the creek behind, winding upward through increasingly rugged terrain. Blackwood set a challenging pace, stopping only briefly to rest Penny and allow Rebecca to stretch her aching muscles. By midday, they had gained significant elevation. The valley below spread out like a rumpled green quilt threaded with the silver ribbon of Carson Creek. "There!" Blackwood said, pointing toward a notch in the ridge ahead. "Miller's Pass. We need to be through it before those clouds decide to drop what they're carrying." Rebecca squinted at the distant saddle between peaks. "How far?" "At this pace, we'll reach the approach by nightfall. Camp there. Cross first thing tomorrow if the weather holds." He glanced at her with concern. "How are you faring?" "I'm fine," Rebecca insisted, though in truth the journey was taking a toll. Her back ached constantly, and the child within her seemed unusually active, as if protesting the constant motion of the horse beneath them. Blackwood's skeptical expression suggested he saw through her brave front, but he didn't press the issue. Instead, he adjusted Penny's load to better distribute the weight, then resumed their upward journey. As the afternoon stretched on, the clouds thickened and descended, enveloping the higher elevations in swirling mist. The temperature dropped noticeably, and Rebecca pulled her shawl tighter, grateful for the additional woolen layer Blackwood had insisted she wear. "Don't like this," Blackwood muttered, more to himself than to her. "Moving in faster than I expected." By late afternoon, visibility had reduced dramatically. Blackwood navigated by memory and occasional landmarks, his focus intense as he led them along a path that had become nearly invisible in the gathering gloom. When they finally stopped to make camp in the shelter of a rocky overhang, the relief on his face was evident. "Any farther, and we'd risk missing the pass entirely," he explained as he quickly established their camp. "Better to wait for morning, hope for a break in the clouds." That night, huddled close to the fire, Rebecca sensed Blackwood's concern despite his outward calm. The mountain man kept walking to the edge of their sheltered area, studying the clouds and testing the wind direction. "It's going to snow, isn't it?" Rebecca finally asked. Blackwood nodded grimly. Question is, how much and how soon? Light snow, we push through the pass tomorrow. Heavy snow. He left the implication hanging. We'd be trapped on this side of the mountains, Rebecca finished for him. Not trapped, Blackwood corrected, just delayed. There's game enough to sustain us, shelter we could improve. He met her eyes directly, but it would mean waiting out winter here. The child would come before we could reach Salem's Crossing. The prospect sent a chill through Rebecca that had nothing to do with the dropping temperature. Giving birth in the wilderness, without medical assistance or the support of other women, was a frightening proposition, even with Blackwood's surprising knowledge of mountain remedies. "Let's hope for light snow, then," she said, forcing confidence into her voice. As if in answer, the first flakes began to fall, sparkling briefly in the firelight before melting into the darkness beyond. Morning revealed a transformed landscape. 3 inches of snow had fallen during the night, draping the mountainside in a pristine white blanket that sparkled blindingly in the early sun. The clouds had temporarily retreated, offering a clear view of Miller's Pass, a narrow saddle between towering peaks, now outlined in stark white against the blue sky. "We go now," Blackwood announced after a hasty breakfast. "This break won't last. More coming." He gestured toward the western horizon where dark clouds still hovered ominously. Rebecca didn't need convincing. Despite the discomfort of another day in the saddle, she understood the urgency of their situation. Blackwood packed the camp with practiced efficiency, and within 20 minutes they were underway, Penny carefully picking her path through the fresh snow. "Beautiful," Rebecca murmured, taking in the transformed wilderness around them. Pines, bowed under their white burden, rock formations wore caps of pristine snow, and even the air seemed different, cleaner, sharper, carrying sounds with crystalline clarity. "Deadly beauty," Blackwood cautioned, though his own expression as he surveyed the landscape held appreciation. Snow hides things, drop-offs, weak ground, game trails, makes everything look the same to untrained eyes. He pointed to a ridge above them. "Fresh snow on steep slopes means avalanche risk. We stay away from those areas." The warning tempered Rebecca's admiration with a healthy dose of respect. Once again, she was struck by how the same forces that created such magnificent scenery could so easily claim human life, beauty and danger inextricably intertwined. Their progress toward the pass slowed considerably compared to the previous day. Blackwood frequently paused to test the path ahead, particularly when the snow seemed deeper or the ground beneath it uncertain. By mid-morning, they had reached the approach to Miller's Pass, a series of switchbacks that would take them up to the saddle between peaks. "Narrower than I remember," Blackwood muttered, studying the snow-covered trail with concern. "Stay on, Penny. Keep to the middle of the path. If I stop, you stop." The ascent was nerve-wracking. The trail, barely wide enough for a single horse, in places clung to the mountainside with steep drops to one side. Snow concealed exactly where solid ground ended and empty air began, adding an element of uncertainty to each step. More than once, small avalanches of snow and rock cascaded down from above, forcing them to press against the mountain wall until the danger passed. Halfway up, they rounded a bend to find their path blocked by a massive pile of snow, rock, and splintered pine. "Clearly the result of a recent slide. Can we get around it?" Rebecca asked, eyeing the formidable obstacle. Blackwood carefully inspected the blockage and the steep slope above it. "No safe way around. Through is our only option." He handed Penny's lead to Rebecca. "Wait here. I'll clear enough for passage." For the next hour, Rebecca watched as Blackwood methodically created a narrow channel through the debris. Using his hunting knife and bare hands, he moved smaller rocks and packed snow, occasionally having to lever larger obstacles out of the way with fallen tree limbs used as makeshift tools. The physical effort was tremendous, but he worked with grim determination, stopping only occasionally to catch his breath. "Should hold," he announced finally, returning to Rebecca with sweat freezing on his brow despite the cold. "Passage is narrow. You'll need to walk Penny through, not enough room to ride safely." Dismounting carefully, Rebecca took Penny's lead and followed Blackwood to the cleared path. The channel was indeed narrow, barely wide enough for the pony to pass through, with unstable-looking walls of packed snow and debris rising on either side. "Quick but careful," Blackwood instructed. "Don't touch the sides if you can help it. Whole thing could shift." Rebecca led Penny into the passage, whispering encouragement to the nervous animal. The pony's hooves crunched loudly on the packed snow, each step seeming to echo off the precarious walls surrounding them. 20 feet of careful progress brought them to the midpoint. A distant rumble from above froze them in place. "Move!" Blackwood's urgent command from behind propelled Rebecca forward just as the walls of the passage began to shudder. She urged Penny ahead with desperate haste, half running despite her awkward gait and the treacherous footing. They burst from the far end of the passage as the carefully constructed channel collapsed behind them, a fresh slide of snow and rock, obliterating Blackwood's hour of work in seconds. Rebecca turned in panic, fearing Blackwood had been caught in the collapse. Relief washed over her as the mountain man emerged from a cloud of snow dust, having evidently dove through the narrowing gap just ahead of the collapse. He rose, brushing snow from his buckskins with remarkable composure given the near miss. "Mountains restless today," he observed with characteristic understatement. "Best keep moving." The remainder of the climb to the pass proceeded without further incident, though the western clouds continued to advance, gradually swallowing the blue sky. By early afternoon, they reached the summit of Miller's Pass, a relatively flat stretch perhaps 50 yards across, bordered by sheer rock faces on either side. The view from the pass was breathtaking. Behind them lay the route they had traveled, the snow-covered mountains falling away toward distant valleys. Ahead, the terrain descended more gradually toward forests that eventually gave way to rolling hills. The first glimpses of the country that would lead them to Salem's Crossing. "We've made it halfway," Blackwood said, allowing himself a small smile of satisfaction. "Downhill from here, at least in terms of elevation." Rebecca felt a surge of accomplishment, tempered by the knowledge that significant challenges remained. The clouds were now rapidly overtaking them, the temperature dropping as mist began to swirl around the pass. "No time to admire the view," Blackwood noted, eyeing the approaching weather. "Need to get as far down the western slope as we can before that hits." The descent began promisingly. The western trail was wider and less steep than the switchbacks. They had climbed, allowing for faster progress, despite the increasingly limited visibility as clouds enveloped them. They had descended perhaps a third of the way when the snow began again, gentle at first, then quickly intensifying into driving. Sheets that reduced visibility to mere yards. "This isn't good," Rebecca called out, struggling to see Blackwood through the whiteness ahead of her. "Keep moving," came his reply, barely audible above the rising wind. "There's a hunter's cabin another mile down. Used it before." The driving. Snow quickly accumulated on the trail, making each step treacherous. Penny snorted nervously, her usual sure-footedness compromised by conditions that concealed potential hazards. Buck stayed close to Blackwood's side, occasionally whining at the deteriorating weather. Rebecca fixed her eyes on Blackwood's back, now little more than a dark shape in the swirling white. Her hands, despite the woolen mittens he had provided, grew numb with cold. The child within her had gone still, a small mercy, as any additional discomfort or distraction might have made the perilous descent impossible to manage. Time lost meaning in the white void of the snowstorm. Minutes stretched like hours as they continued their slow, careful progress downward. Rebecca found herself entering an almost trance-like state, focus narrowed to the simple, essential tasks. Keep Penny moving. Stay on the trail, watch for Blackwood's signals, ignore the cold and fatigue. There! Blackwood's voice suddenly cut through the storm's howl. Cabin ahead! Rebecca squinted through the driving snow and could just make out a dark rectangular shape, unmistakably man-made among the natural contours of the mountainside. The sight gave her renewed energy for the final stretch of their day's journey. The hunter's cabin was little more than a crude shelter, 4 walls of rough-hewn logs, a simple plank door, and a roof that sagged alarmingly under its burden of snow. But after hours exposed to the elements, it seemed as welcoming as the finest hotel. Blackwood quickly cleared snow from the entrance and led Penny to a small lean-to attached to one side of the structure. It wouldn't completely protect the pony from the elements, but it offered far better shelter than the open mountainside. Buck shook himself vigorously, sending snow flying in all directions before following Rebecca into the cabin's dim interior. The single room was Spartan but serviceable, a small stone fireplace against one wall, a rough wooden platform that might generously be called a bed, and little else. Dust and cobwebs suggested it had been some time since anyone had used the shelter. Not exactly the Palmer House, Blackwood remarked, referencing the famous Chicago hotel as he immediately set about preparing a fire. But it's solid enough. Hunter named Jenkins built it years back, died in '64 during the war, but the cabin's been a lifesaver for many travelers since. The small fire Blackwood coaxed to life gradually pushed back the cabin's bone-deep chill. As feeling returned to her extremities, Rebecca became aware of just how exhausted she truly was. Every muscle ached, and a deep fatigue unlike anything she'd experienced before seeped through her body. "You need rest," Blackwood observed, helping her settle onto the wooden platform with their bedrolls providing minimal cushioning. "I'll fix something warm to eat." Outside, the storm intensified, wind howling around the cabin's corners and driving snow through every tiny crack in the aging logs. Rebecca found herself profoundly grateful for the crude shelter that stood between them and what had become a full mountain blizzard. "Will the storm delay us long?" she asked as Blackwood prepared a simple meal using supplies from their packs and melted snow. "Hard to say," he replied honestly. "Could blow over by morning, could last days. Mountain weather's unpredictable this time of year." He handed her a tin cup of hot broth. "Drink. You need to stay warm from the inside out." As she sipped the savory liquid, Rebecca reflected on how quickly circumstances changed in this environment, from clear skies and spectacular views to life-threatening conditions in the span of hours. The Sawyer party's fears about winter travel suddenly seemed less exaggerated, though their solution remained unconscionable. "You're thinking about them again," Blackwood observed, his perception uncanny. "The Sawyers," Rebecca nodded. "Wondering if they faced similar conditions, if they thought about what might have happened to me." She stared into the small fire. "If they feel any remorse." "Some might," Blackwood allowed. "Others sleep just fine after doing worse." He added another branch to the flames. "People show their true character in moments of crisis. Some rise, some fall, and some abandon pregnant women to die," Rebecca added bitterly, "and some risk their lives to help strangers," Blackwood countered quietly. The simple statement hung in the air between them, a reminder that for every act of cruelty or indifference, there existed the possibility of compassion and sacrifice. Rebecca found herself studying Blackwood's weathered profile in the firelight, wondering what other crises he had faced in his life, what choices had shaped him into the man who now shared this small refuge against the storm. Outside, the blizzard raged unchecked, but within the cabin's rough walls, something subtle had shifted, a deepening trust, a growing awareness that their partnership had evolved beyond mere necessity into something neither had anticipated when their paths first crossed. Morning brought no relief from the storm. If anything, the blizzard had intensified overnight, wind shrieking around the cabin with renewed fury. Blackwood's attempt to open the door resulted in a cascade of snow tumbling into the small space. The entrance was nearly blocked by drifts that had accumulated during the night. "We're not going anywhere today," he announced, shoveling the snow back outside with a broken shovel he'd found in a corner. "Maybe not tomorrow either." Rebecca watched from her makeshift bed, worry creasing her brow. "How long can a storm like this last?" 3 days is typical, sometimes a week. Blackwood secured the door against further intrusion. "I've seen one last nearly 2 weeks, but that was unusual." The prospect of being confined indefinitely in the tiny cabin was daunting, particularly given their limited supplies. As if reading her thoughts, Blackwood addressed her unspoken concern. "Food won't be a problem. I packed extra and there's game if needed, storm or no storm." He checked their water supply, melted snow in a small pot. "Wood is the bigger concern. Cabin stock is low." Rebecca glanced at the meager pile of split logs beside the fireplace. "How will you get more with everything buried in snow?" Blackwood donned his heavy coat. "Same way men have for centuries, one piece at a time." For the next hour, Rebecca listened as Blackwood labored outside, the cabin door opening periodically. To admit swirls of snow, blasts of frigid air, and eventually armloads of wood. He had located a fallen tree not far from the cabin and was methodically harvesting what he could reach. By the time he returned for good, his beard was frozen with ice, but they had enough fuel to maintain the fire for at least 2 days. "Need to check on Penny," he said after warming himself briefly by the fire. Once again, he disappeared into the storm. Left alone, Rebecca took stock of their shelter. Despite its crude construction, the cabin was reasonably weathertight except for a few gaps between logs where snow occasionally sifted through. The fireplace drew well, providing both heat and a means to cook. What the space lacked in comfort, it made up for in practical functionality, precisely what was needed in these mountains. When Blackwood returned, he brought an unexpected surprise. Penny had been moved into the cabin with them. The pony stood uncertainly just inside the door, steam rising from her snow-dampened coat. Lean-to collapsed under the snow weight. Blackwood explained, brushing ice from his clothing. "She wouldn't survive out there. Hope you don't mind the company." Rebecca smiled despite their predicament. "At least she brings her own blanket." The jest earned a rare chuckle from Blackwood. He arranged a space for Penny near the door, farthest from the fire, but still within the cabin's warmth. Buck immediately settled beside the pony, the 2 animals apparently comfortable with this unusual indoor arrangement. As the day wore on, confined by the storm to a single room, Rebecca discovered unexpected aspects of her rescuer. Blackwood, though a man of few words by nature, possessed a talent for crafting small, useful items. From a pocket, he produced a knife and several pieces of wood he'd set aside from the firewood. With methodical precision, he began to carve. "What are you making?" Rebecca asked, watching his large hands move with surprising delicacy. "Spoon," he replied simply. "Noticed you struggling with the tin one." Indeed, the battered utensil they'd been sharing had a bent handle that made eating awkward. Rebecca was touched that he'd noticed such a small discomfort amid their larger concerns. As he worked, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the storm's persistent howl and the occasional shifting of the animals. Rebecca found herself studying Blackwood's face, the lines that spoke of years in harsh weather, the small scar above his right eyebrow, the way his brow furrowed slightly in concentration as he carved. "May I ask you something personal?" She ventured after a time. Blackwood looked up from his work, neither encouraging nor discouraging the question. "Why have you never married? A man with your capabilities, your education." He considered the question with characteristic thoroughness. Before answering, "Came close once. Sarah Thornton, daughter of my father's business partner in Philadelphia. Pretty, well-read." A shadow crossed his face. "Then the war came. I enlisted. She wrote faithfully at first, then less often. He tested the edge of the spoon with his thumb, shaving a bit more wood from one side. When I returned, she was engaged. To a man who'd paid for a substitute to fight in his place, said she couldn't marry someone who carried the war with him. The quiet bitterness in those final words revealed more about Blackwood's past than any lengthy explanation could have. Rebecca thought of her father, how he'd sometimes wake shouting in the night, how certain sounds would cause him to go rigid with tension. "She wasn't wrong about the war coming home with you," Rebecca observed gently. "She was wrong to think it made you less worthy." Blackwood's hands stilled momentarily before resuming their work. "What about you?" he asked, clearly preferring to shift attention away from himself. "Was it always Bennett, or were there others?" "Only William," Rebecca admitted. "My father's declining health limited my social circles. William was the banker's son who handled father's modest accounts. He was attentive when others weren't." She absently traced patterns on the rough blanket covering her. "I mistook courtesy for character." "Common mistake," Blackwood said, not unkindly. "Fine manners and fine character aren't always found together." The conversation lapsed into silence again, but a different quality of silence, one built on shared confidences rather than mere convenience. Outside, the storm continued unabated, but inside the small cabin, something subtle was taking shape between two people thrown together by circumstance. As evening approached, Blackwood prepared a more substantial meal than their usual trail fare, making use of ingredients he'd been saving. The simple stew, enriched with dried vegetables and herbs, was the most satisfying food Rebecca had tasted since leaving the wagon train. "You cook well for a bachelor," she observed, savoring each bite. "Necessity," he replied with a shrug. "Man eats poorly out here, he doesn't last long. Body needs proper fuel, same as the fire." After they'd eaten, Blackwood surprised her by producing a battered deck of cards from his pack. "Patience," he offered. "Passes the time." They played several rounds of the solitaire game, then Blackwood taught her a two-player variation. The simple activity provided welcome distraction from the confined space and uncertain future that awaited them beyond the storm. When it came time to sleep, Blackwood arranged their bedrolls as he had the previous night, Rebecca on the wooden platform that served as a bed, himself on the floor nearby. The fire had warmed the cabin considerably, but the temperature would drop as the flames died down overnight. "Take my coat as an extra layer," Blackwood offered, draping the heavy garment over her before she could protest. "I'm used to the cold." "What about you?" Rebecca asked, concerned despite the practical sense of his offer. "Sleep warm as a bear," he assured her, settling into his bedroll with Buck curled against his side. Mountain man's privilege. Rebecca suspected this was at least partly false, but she accepted the coat gratefully, its weight and the lingering warmth of its owner providing additional comfort against the night chill. As the fire's light dimmed to glowing embers, she found herself more aware of Blackwood's presence than ever, his steady breathing, the solid reality of him just a few feet away. "Jeremiah," she said softly, using his given name for the first time. "Thank you, not just for today, but for everything since you found me." In the near darkness, she couldn't see his expression, but his voice came back quiet and certain. "No thanks needed for doing what's right, Rebecca." The simple response embodied everything she had come to understand about the man, his straightforward moral code, his lack of expectation for reward or recognition, his fundamental decency in a world where such qualities had become increasingly rare. Morning brought a lull in the storm, not an end, but a temporary abatement that allowed Blackwood to venture further from the cabin. He returned with grim news. Trails completely buried, 3 feet of snow in places, more where it's drifted. He removed his snow-caked gloves. "And there's more coming, can smell it in the air." Rebecca's heart sank. How long until we can travel? Hard to say. Need to wait for the storm to pass completely, then give the snow time to settle and compact. He avoided meeting her eyes. Could be a week, maybe more. The implication hung in the air between them. A week's delay might still allow them to reach Salem's Crossing before her condition made travel impossible, but anything longer would put them dangerously close to her time. "I see," she said quietly, unconsciously placing a protective hand over her belly. "There's another option," Blackwood said after a moment's hesitation. "Carson's Mill, small settlement, hardly more than a few cabins, about 2 days' journey from here when the trails are clear." "You never mentioned this before," Rebecca noted, curious at this new information. "For good reason. It's not much of a place. Just a mill, a trading post, and a handful of miners who haven't caught gold fever badly enough to push farther west." Blackwood frowned. "No doctor, but there's a midwife of sorts. Widow Simmons. Delivered most of the children born to the miners' wives. Why didn't we aim for Carson's Mill instead of Salem's Crossing originally?" Blackwood's expression darkened. "Jack Carson runs things there. He and I have history, not the sort that makes for a welcome return." Rebecca studied him curiously. "What kind of history?" "The kind involving his daughter," Blackwood answered, reluctantly. "Eleanor Carson fancied herself in love with me 3 years back. Jack made it clear a mountain man wasn't suitable for his only child, especially one with my background." A muscle tightened in his jaw. Words were exchanged. Then, fists. "I haven't set foot near Carson's Mill since." "I see," Rebecca said, understanding why he'd avoided mentioning the settlement before. "But you think they might help me?" "Eleanor's married to the trading post owner now. Jack's mellowed some, according to trappers who pass through." Blackwood met her gaze directly. "More importantly, it's reachable when the snow settles, even if Salem's Crossing isn't." The revelation that there might be an alternative destination offered a fragile hope, though one complicated by Blackwood's personal history with the settlement. Rebecca weighed this new information carefully. "Let's wait and see what the weather does," she suggested. "No need to make decisions until we have to." Blackwood nodded agreement, but his expression remained troubled as he stared into the fire, his thoughts clearly dwelling on a past she only partially understood and a future neither of them could predict with any certainty. 3 days passed with the storm alternating between raging fury and deceptive lulls. During the brief periods of calm, Blackwood ventured out to secure more firewood, check on wildlife activity in the vicinity, and assess the condition of the trails. Each time he returned with the same conclusion: travel remained impossible. For the foreseeable future, the confinement could have been maddening, but Rebecca found herself adapting to the rhythm of their shared existence with surprising ease. Mornings began with Blackwood rekindling the fire, while she organized their diminishing supplies. Afternoons were spent in various tasks: mending clothing, fashioning snowshoes from materials Blackwood gathered, playing cards, or simply talking. Evenings brought a shared meal and the comfort of knowing they had survived another day. On the morning of the 4th day, Rebecca woke to complete silence. The constant backdrop of wind that had accompanied their every waking moment had vanished. Blackwood was already at the door, carefully clearing the substantial snowdrift that had accumulated against it. "Storm's past," he announced, allowing fresh air and blindingly bright sunlight to stream into the cabin. "At least for now." Rebecca joined him at the doorway, gasping at the transformed landscape before them. Every surface was blanketed in pristine white, tree branches bowed under their heavy burdens, and the very air seemed crystalline with cold. The beauty was undeniable, but so was the challenge it presented. "How soon can we travel?" she asked, watching as Buck bounded joyfully into the snow, disappearing up to his chest before scrambling back out. "Not immediately," Blackwood replied, studying the terrain with a practiced eye. "Snow's too deep and loose. We'd exhaust ourselves covering a mile." He pointed toward the sun, already climbing in a clear blue sky. "Need a day or two of this. Sun softens the top layer during the day, night freezes it to a crust. That's when we can move without sinking." Disappointment and relief warred within Rebecca. Every day of delay decreased their chances of reaching Salem's Crossing before her time came, yet the prospect of immediate travel through such difficult conditions was daunting. "I'll scout our options," Blackwood continued, reaching for his snowshoes, crude but functional constructions of bent wood and rawhide. "Carson's Mill lies that way," he pointed southwest. "Might be more accessible than continuing west toward Salem's Crossing." "How long will you be gone?" Rebecca asked, suddenly anxious at the prospect of being left alone. "Few hours at most. Need to see how far the snow extends, check if any trails are partially clear." He secured the snowshoes to his boots. "You'll be safe here. Fire's set, Buck. We'll stay with you." As if understanding, the dog returned to the cabin, shaking off snow before settling near Rebecca's feet. Blackwood checked his rifle, tucked his hunting knife more securely into his belt, and prepared to depart. "Jeremiah," Rebecca called, using his given name with greater ease now. "Be careful." He nodded once, his expression softening momentarily, before he turned away and set off across the glistening expanse of snow. The cabin felt strangely empty without his presence. Rebecca busied herself with practical tasks, melting snow for water, preparing a stew that could simmer until his return, organizing their belongings for possible departure. Yet her thoughts kept returning to the man himself, to the growing complexity of her feelings toward him. What had begun as simple gratitude had evolved into something more nuanced. Respect for his capabilities, appreciation for his unfailing consideration, and increasingly a warmth that went beyond mere friendship. The realization troubled her. Her judgment in matters of the heart had proven catastrophically flawed once before. Could she trust these emerging feelings, or were they merely a product of their extraordinary circumstances? Buck's sudden alert posture interrupted her reflections. The dog moved to the door, ears forward, a low growl forming in his throat. "What is it, boy?" Rebecca asked, instantly tense. "Is Blackwood returning?" Buck's continued growling suggested otherwise. Something Datubu, or someone, was approaching, and the dog didn't recognize them as friend. Rebecca moved cautiously to the window, wiping frost from the crude glass to peer outside. 3 figures on snowshoes were making their way toward the cabin, following the tracks Blackwood had left earlier, men judging by their size and gait, all carrying rifles. Fear clutched at her heart. Who would be traveling these mountains during winter? Trappers, miners, or something more sinister? With Blackwood gone, she was effectively defenseless, apart from the small knife she carried and whatever protection Buck might provide. Thinking quickly, Rebecca gathered her most essential belongings into a small bundle and concealed it beneath. The bedding. If these were thieves, at least she'd preserve something. She positioned herself near the fireplace, where the iron poker might serve as an improvised weapon if needed, and waited as the figures drew nearer. A heavy knock rattled the cabin door. "Hello, the cabin!" a male voice called. "Anyone inside?" Rebecca remained silent, heart hammering. Buck continued to growl, hackles raised. "We saw the smoke," the voice continued. "We're not looking for trouble, just shelter from the cold for a spell. Been traveling 2 days through this cursed snow." The request seemed reasonable enough, but caution kept Rebecca from responding. Immediately, Blackwood had mentioned that the cabin was known to travelers. It was entirely possible these were simply men caught in the same storm, seeking temporary refuge. "I'm alone except for my dog," she finally called back, deciding that transparency about Buck's presence might discourage ill intentions. "My husband will return shortly from hunting." The small lie about her husband seemed prudent under the circumstances. "We understand, ma'am," the voice replied. "We won't impose long, just need to warm ourselves before continuing to Carson's Mill." The mention of their destination provided a small measure of reassurance. Reluctantly, Rebecca moved to unbar the door, keeping Buck close at her side. 3 snow-covered men filed into the cabin, stamping and brushing off the worst of the white powder before fully entering. Their appearance was rough, but not immediately threatening. Trail-worn clothing, several days' growth of beard, the lean, hungry look of men who'd been traveling hard. "Thank you kindly, ma'am," the leader said, removing his hat to reveal thinning, grey hair. "Name's Walter Prescott. These are my sons, Thomas and James." The younger men nodded respectfully, keeping their distance as if understanding her wariness. All 3 placed their rifles carefully by the door, a gesture Rebecca interpreted as deliberate reassurance. "Rebecca Harlow," she replied, not offering her hand. "You mentioned Carson's Mill?" "Aye, headed there from Pine Ridge," Walter explained, moving gratefully toward the fire, but being careful not to block her access to the poker she still stood near. "Got word my sister's taken ill. She runs the boarding house there, Martha Simmons." Rebecca started at the name. "The midwife?" Walter looked surprised. "You know Martha?" "Of her," Rebecca corrected, unconsciously placing a hand on her swollen belly. "My husband mentioned her skills might be needed soon." Understanding dawned in the older man's weathered face. "Ah, I see. Martha's brought half the children in 3 counties into the world. You'd be in good hands with her." He glanced around. "The cabin. Though I'm puzzled why you'd be up here rather than in town, in your condition." Rebecca hesitated, unsure how much to reveal to these strangers. "We were traveling to Salem's Crossing when the storm caught us. This cabin provided shelter." The older son, Thomas, frowned. "Salem's Crossing? That's a fair piece from here, especially in winter." His tone suggested he found the explanation suspicious. "My husband knows these mountains well," Rebecca replied, maintaining the pretense. "He believed we could make it before the worst weather set in." Walter removed gloves to warm his hands by the fire. "Man makes plans, God laughs, especially in these mountains. We intended to reach Carson's Mill 2 days ago ourselves." As the men thawed from their journey, Rebecca maintained a cautious distance, Buck remaining vigilantly at her side. Their presence filled the small cabin, making it seem cramped after days, with just Blackwood for company. "Might we trouble you for some hot coffee if you have it?" Walter asked. "Been living on jerky and cold biscuits since yesterday." Rebecca hesitated only briefly before nodding. Hospitality was an unwritten law of the frontier. One never knew when one might be the traveler in need. She set water to boil, measuring out some of their precious coffee grounds. As she worked, she noticed the younger son, James, watching her with an odd expression. Unlike his father and brother, who had maintained respectful distance, his gaze felt intrusive, lingering too long on her figure. "Haven't seen a woman in 2 months," he remarked, something in his tone making Rebecca distinctly uncomfortable. "Certainly not one in a family way." "James," his father reprimanded sharply, "mind your manners." The young man subsided, but his eyes continued to follow Rebecca's movements in a way that kept her nerves on edge. Buck seemed to sense her discomfort, positioning himself between Rebecca and the newcomers. "Your dog's protective," Thomas observed, eyeing Buck warily. "As he should be," came a new voice from the doorway. All heads turned to see Blackwood filling the entrance, rifle held casually but unmistakably ready for use. His expression was controlled, but Rebecca could read the tension in his stance, the careful way his eyes assessed each stranger. "This is my husband," Rebecca said quickly, relieved beyond measure at his return. "Jeremiah." If Blackwood was surprised by her claim, he didn't show it. He stepped fully into the cabin, nodding briefly to the visitors while moving to stand beside Rebecca. "Walter Prescott and his sons," she explained. "They're traveling to Carson's Mill. Walter's sister is Martha Simmons." "The midwife," Blackwood acknowledged, some of the tension leaving his shoulders, though his vigilance remained evident. "Your timing's fortunate. We were just discussing whether to head there ourselves once the snow firms up." Walter brightened. "You'd be welcome to travel with us. More safety in numbers, and we know the quickest routes." Blackwood exchanged a glance with Rebecca, silent communication passing between them. The offer made practical sense, yet trusting their safety to strangers required consideration. "We'll discuss it," Blackwood replied noncommittally. "How long? Were you planning to rest here? Just long enough to warm up and have something hot in our bellies," Walter assured him. "Hoping to make Carson's Mill by tomorrow night if the weather holds." The coffee finished brewing, and Rebecca poured cups for everyone. The atmosphere in the cabin had shifted with Blackwood's return, less tense in some ways, more complicated in others. The visitors sipped gratefully at the hot beverage, while Blackwood quietly updated Rebecca on what he'd found during his scouting trip. "Trail to Carson's Mill is partially broken," he murmured. "Someone's been through recently, probably these three. Makes travel easier if we follow their path." "And Salem's Crossing?" she whispered back. He shook his head slightly. "No chance. Too far, too much snow. The decision was effectively made for them. If they were to reach any settlement before Rebecca's time came, Carson's Mill was their only option, complicated history or not." As the Prescott men prepared to depart after their brief rest, Walter turned to Blackwood. "We'll camp about 4 miles southwest, where the trail meets Coldwater Creek. Join us there tomorrow, if you're of a mind to travel together." Blackwood nodded, neither accepting nor declining the offer outright. Safe travels. When the visitors had gone, the cabin seemed suddenly spacious again despite its modest dimensions. Rebecca sank onto her bedroll, the tension of the encounter leaving her drained. "Husband?" Blackwood asked, a hint of amusement breaking through his usual reserve. "It seemed safer," Rebecca explained, feeling her cheeks warm slightly. "A woman. Alone, especially in my condition." "Wise precaution," he agreed. "And though you should know the youngest one, James, didn't believe it for a second." Rebecca's unease about the younger Prescott son returned. "I noticed he watched me differently." Blackwood's expression hardened. "I noticed too." He checked his rifle methodically. "If we travel with them, he'll understand the arrangement is permanent, whether it's true or not." The implication was clear. Blackwood would continue the pretense of being her husband to ensure her safety. What remained unspoken was how this charade might complicate their eventual arrival at Carson's Mill, where people knew him and his past. As evening settled over the mountains, bringing a deep, star-filled clarity to the sky, Rebecca found herself contemplating the strange turns her journey had taken, from abandoned and desperate to protected and cared for, and now approaching a settlement with a man she barely knew, yet trusted, implicitly, posing as his wife. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new terrain, both physical and emotional. But tonight, watching Blackwood quietly preparing for their potential departure, Rebecca acknowledged a truth she had been avoiding. Whatever happened at Carson's Mill, whatever came after, she was no longer the same woman who had been abandoned by the Sawyer party. And perhaps that transformation was the most unexpected gift of all. Dawn painted the snow-covered mountains in hues of pink and gold as Rebecca and Blackwood prepared to depart the cabin that had sheltered them through the storm. The night had brought the freeze Blackwood had hoped for, creating a firm crust atop the deep snow, conditions that would make travel difficult but possible. "We'll follow the Prescott's trail," Blackwood explained as he secured their belongings, "to Penny's back. Makes the going easier, though I'd prefer not to rely on them entirely." Rebecca understood his caution. While Walter Prescott seemed decent enough, something about his younger son James had unsettled them both. "Do you think they're trustworthy?" "Old man likely is," Blackwood replied, checking Penny's makeshift harness. "Trail-worn, but honest eyes. Sons are harder to read, especially the younger one." He glanced at her. "We'll camp with them tonight, since it makes sense for safety, but I'll keep watch." The unspoken arrangement continued. They would present themselves as husband and wife. Rebecca found herself strangely unbothered by the pretense, though she wondered how Blackwood truly felt about it. They set out as the sun crested the eastern ridges. Blackwood had fashioned crude snowshoes for Rebecca, similar to his own, but she rode Penny whenever the trail permitted. Buck ranged ahead and behind, seemingly delighted by the fresh snow despite the difficult travel conditions. Following the Prescott's trail made their progress steadier than it would have been otherwise. The three men had broken a rough path through the deepest drifts, their footprints now frozen into serviceable stepping places. By midday, they had covered nearly 4 miles. Far better progress than Blackwood had anticipated. "We're making good time," Rebecca observed during a brief rest, sipping melted snow from a tin cup. "Too good," Blackwood replied, frowning slightly as he surveyed the path ahead. They moved fast for men supposedly traveling through unbroken snow. The observation hung between them, another small reason for caution regarding their potential. Traveling companions. If the Prescotts hadn't been truthful about their journey so far, what else might they be concealing? As afternoon shadows lengthened across the pristine landscape, they approached the meeting point Walter had described, where the mountain trail intersected with Coldwater Creek. From their elevated position, they could see 3 figures had established a camp in a sheltered clearing beside the frozen waterway. Blackwood paused, studying the scene below with a tracker's attentiveness. "Something's not right," he murmured. Rebecca followed his gaze, but saw nothing obviously amiss. "What do you mean?" "No horses. Men traveling from Pine Ridge would have mounts, especially in winter." His eyes narrowed. "And their gear, too, light for the journey they claimed." A chill that had nothing to do with the temperature ran through Rebecca. "Should we avoid them?" Blackwood considered this, weighing their options with characteristic thoroughness. "Too late for that. They've spotted us." He nodded toward the camp, where one of the figures was now pointing in their direction. "Besides, alternate routes would be difficult in this snow, maybe impossible for Penny." He turned to Rebecca, his expression serious. "Stay close to me. If anything seems wrong, anything at all, we leave immediately, whatever the risk." The descent to the creek took nearly half an hour, negotiating switchbacks and snow-covered slopes. As they approached the camp, Walter Prescott hailed them with apparent genuine warmth. "Thought you might not come. Welcome, welcome." He gestured toward a robust fire burning in a stone-lined pit. Just in time for coffee and rabbit stew, the camp was efficiently arranged, with a lean-to shelter constructed from pine boughs, providing protection from the wind. Thomas, the older son, nodded a greeting while continuing to tend the stew pot. James merely watched their arrival with the same unsettling intensity Rebecca remembered from the cabin. "Appreciate the hospitality," Blackwood replied, helping Rebecca dismount before securing Penny nearby. His movements were casual, but Rebecca noticed he positioned himself to keep all 3 men in his line of sight. "Martha will be glad for the company," Walter continued, pouring coffee into tin cups for them. "Carson's mill gets mighty quiet in winter. Most folks head to the goldfields or back east when the snow threatens." "How far to the settlement from here?" Rebecca asked, accepting the warm beverage gratefully. "Day and a half, weather permitting," Walter replied. "Trail follows the creek most of the way, fairly easy going once we hit the valley floor tomorrow." As they shared the simple meal, Rebecca observed the dynamics among the Prescott men. Walter maintained an affable demeanor, asking polite questions, about their journey while sharing stories of his sister's exploits as a midwife. Thomas spoke little, focusing on practical matters of the camp. James alternated between brooding silence and brief, intense contributions to the conversation, his gaze repeatedly drifting to Rebecca despite Blackwood's protective presence beside her. "You never mentioned what business takes you to Salem's Crossing," James said during a lull in the conversation, his tone suggesting more than casual interest. "Work," Blackwood answered before Rebecca could respond. "My wife's a skilled seamstress. Mining towns pay well for such talents." "Seems a strange time to travel with a baby coming," James persisted, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Timing isn't always ours to choose," Rebecca replied evenly, placing a hand on her belly. "We didn't anticipate the early winter," Walter shot, his son a warning glance before changing the subject. "Trail ahead follows Coldwater Creek through the valley. Beautiful country, even in winter. Used to trap there years back before the mill brought more settlers." As darkness descended, sleeping arrangements were established. The Prescotts in their lean-to, Rebecca and Blackwood creating their own smaller shelter several yards away. Buck positioned himself at the entrance to their makeshift dwelling, alert even in repose. "I don't trust them," Blackwood whispered once they were alone, his voice barely audible above the night sounds of the wilderness. "Their story doesn't fit their equipment or their knowledge of the terrain." "What do you think they want?" Rebecca asked, suddenly acutely aware of their vulnerability. "Not certain yet, but we'll adjust our plans." He checked his rifle, ensuring it was loaded and within easy reach. "I'll sleep lightly. At first light we leave before they expect us to stir." Rebecca nodded, understanding the strategy. A head start might be crucial if the Prescotts harbored ill intentions. "What about Carson's Mill?" "We'll still head there, but by a different route. I know these mountains better than they realize." Blackwood's expression was grim in the faint moonlight filtering through the pine boughs. "Try to rest. Tomorrow may test us both." As Rebecca settled into their shared bedroll, grateful for Blackwood's solid presence beside her, she found herself reflecting on how quickly circumstances could shift in this harsh environment, from the relative security of the cabin to this uncertain night, watching for danger from those who had appeared to offer assistance. Yet even amid this new tension, she recognized her situation had fundamentally changed since those desperate hours. After the Sawyer party's abandonment, then she had faced the wilderness alone, without resources or knowledge. Now, whatever dangers lurked ahead, she faced them with a protector whose capabilities she had come to trust implicitly. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by the occasional snap of the dying fire and the whisper of wind through pine branches. In her dreams, Rebecca saw Carson's Mill waiting in a sunlit valley, promising safety and the care she would soon desperately need, if only they could reach it. Morning arrived with a shroud of fog embracing the mountains, visibility reduced to mere yards beyond their shelter. Blackwood touched Rebecca's shoulder gently, rousing her from uneasy slumber. "Perfect," he whispered, gesturing toward the thick mist. "Nature's providing cover for our departure." They worked silently, gathering their belongings and readying Penny, while the Prescott camp remained quiet in the pre-dawn stillness. Buck stayed close, seemingly understanding the need for stealth. Within 15 minutes, they were ready to depart, their shelter dismantled to leave minimal evidence of their plans. "This way," Blackwood murmured, leading them not along the creek as expected, but up a narrow draw that angled away from their original path. Old trappers' route. Few know it exists. The fog provided concealment, but made navigation challenging. Rebecca marveled at Blackwood's confidence as he moved through the white void, identifying landmarks invisible to her untrained eyes. Penny followed trustingly, hooves muffled by the snow-covered ground. They had traveled perhaps half a mile when a shout echoed through the fog behind them. "They've discovered we're gone," Blackwood said, quickening their pace. "Fog works both ways, helps us hide but slows our progress. For the next hour, they pushed forward relentlessly, the sounds of pursuit occasionally reaching them through the mist. The terrain grew increasingly difficult as they ascended a ridge Blackwood claimed would eventually connect with the main trail to Carson's Mill. "Why would they follow us?" Rebecca asked during a brief pause to catch their breath. "What could they possibly want?" Blackwood's expression darkened. "Not what, who. There's a bounty on me in certain territories." "A bounty?" Rebecca stared in disbelief. "For what?" "Army desertion," he replied grimly. "Which never happened. Was honorably discharged after Gettysburg. Have the papers to prove it. But a man named Rawlins in Colorado Territory claims otherwise. Claims I fled during battle, cost men their lives. Why would he lie about such a thing?" "Because I stopped him from assaulting a Ute woman 3 years ago. Shot him in the leg." Blackwood's jaw tightened at the memory. "He survived, unfortunately, been spreading lies and offering rewards ever since." The revelation explained so much. Blackwood's solitary existence, his wariness around strangers, his reluctance to visit settlements. Rebecca felt a surge of indignation on his behalf. The Prescotts are bounty hunters, then? "Not by trade, I'd wager, but $500 is tempting for men struggling through winter with no prospects." He checked the terrain ahead. "We need to keep moving. Fog's starting to thin." The ascent grew steeper, taxing Rebecca's already limited stamina. Pain radiated across her lower back, a warning she tried to ignore. This was no time for her body. To remind her of its fragile condition, Blackwood noticed her discomfort, despite her efforts to conceal it. "How bad?" he asked directly. "Manageable," she replied, not entirely truthfully. "Just the strain of climbing." He studied her face for a moment, clearly not believing her assessment, but accepting the necessity of continued movement. "Ridge top is just ahead. Once across, we'll have clear path to Carson's Mill. Town's visible from there on clear days." The promise of civilization so near provided fresh determination. Rebecca pushed forward, one hand braced against Penny for support, the other cradling her belly as another wave of discomfort passed through her. They reached the ridge crest as the fog began to dissipate, revealing a spectacular vista of snow-covered valleys stretching toward distant mountains. Far below, perhaps 5 miles distant, a cluster of buildings and the distinctive wheel of a watermill marked their destination, Carson's Mill, nestled beside a river that cut through the white landscape like a dark ribbon. "We made it," Rebecca breathed, momentarily overcome by the sight. "Not yet," Blackwood cautioned, pointing. Behind them, where 3 figures had emerged from the fog, moving steadily along their trail. They're persistent, I'll give them that. The descent from the ridge offered both advantage and risk. Faster travel, but less cover, more visible to their pursuers. Blackwood led them down a series of switchbacks, setting a pace that balanced speed with safety on the treacherous slope. They had covered perhaps half the distance to the valley floor when Rebecca gasped. A sharp pain, unlike the previous discomfort seizing her midsection. She clutched at Penny's mane to steady herself, the sensation passing after several seconds, but leaving no doubt about its meaning. "The baby," she managed, meeting Blackwood's concerned gaze. "It's starting." Blackwood's expression revealed momentary alarm before settling into resolute determination. "How far apart?" "First one," she replied, trying to keep fear from her voice. "But unmistakable." He nodded once, recalculating their situation with characteristic pragmatism. "Town's still 2 hours away at our current pace. First babies usually take time." He glanced back up the trail. "Prescotts are falling behind, but haven't given up. I can continue," Rebecca insisted, straightening with effort. "Better to face this in town than on a mountainside." They pressed on, Blackwood now staying closer to her side, watchful for signs of increasing labor. The valley floor provided easier travel once they reached it. following a well-established trail that paralleled the river flowing toward Carson's mill. The settlement grew steadily larger as they approached, a collection of perhaps 20 structures clustered around the mill that gave the town its name. Smoke rose from several chimneys, promising warmth and human presence after days in the wilderness. As they neared the outskirts, a second contraction gripped Rebecca, stronger than the first, forcing her to stop and breathe through the pain. Blackwood's hand found hers, offering silent support until the wave passed. "Almost there," he encouraged when she could focus again. "See that two-story building with the wide porch? That's Martha Simmons' boarding house." Before they could continue, shouting erupted behind them. The Prescotts had gained ground during their brief stop, now close enough for their voices to carry clearly. "Blackwood, stop where you are!" Walter's authoritative call echoed across the snow-covered field, separating them. $500 for your surrender." Blackwood positioned himself between Rebecca and the approaching men. "Get to Martha's," he instructed quietly. "I'll handle this." "No," Rebecca refused, clutching his arm. "I won't leave you to face them alone. This isn't your fight." "It became mine the moment you saved my life," she countered with unexpected fierceness. "We finish this journey together." Something shifted in Blackwood's expression. Surprise, followed by a warmth that had nothing to do with their physical exertion. Before he could respond, a new voice joined the confrontation. "What's all this commotion about?" A stocky man with a silver beard emerged from the mill, accompanied by several others. "Jeremiah Blackwood? That really you?" "Jack Carson," Blackwood acknowledged, relief evident in his voice at the arrival of the mill owner and unofficial leader of the settlement. Carson approached, eyeing the tableau with obvious curiosity. Blackwood and the visibly pregnant Rebecca on one side, the 3 armed Prescotts on the other. "Thought you swore never to set foot in my town again." "Circumstances changed," Blackwood replied simply, gesturing toward Rebecca. Carson's weathered face softened as he took in Rebecca's condition. "So I see." He turned toward the Prescotts, expression hardening. "And what business brings you men to my town, weapons drawn?" "This man's wanted," Walter asserted, though with less confidence now that they faced a group rather than isolated. "Prey. Army deserter with a bounty on his head." "That's so." Carson looked skeptical. "Got papers to prove these claims?" James stepped forward impatiently. "Don't need papers. Reward poster describes him perfectly." "Interesting," Carson mused. "Because I have Jeremiah's discharge papers in my safe. Honorable discharge, signed by General Meade himself after Gettysburg." His gaze hardened. "Been meaning to send them to authorities in Colorado to clear up that unfortunate misunderstanding with Rawlins." The revelation visibly deflated the Prescotts. Resolve. Walter lowered his rifle slightly, uncertainty replacing his earlier determination. "Now then," Carson continued, "I suggest you gentlemen move along. Carson's mill has no place for bounty hunters chasing innocent men." The workers from the mill had spread out, creating a clear show of force that left little room for argument. As the standoff dissolved, another contraction seized Rebecca, this one strong enough to make her cry out. Martha Simmons, summoned by one of the townspeople, appeared as if conjured by the sound, her practical presence immediately taking charge of the situation. "Inside now," the older woman ordered, supporting Rebecca with surprising strength. "Jack, clear these fools. Out of my way. Jeremiah, don't just stand there. Your wife needs you." The word wife hung in the air as Rebecca was ushered toward the boarding house, Blackwood following close behind. There would be time later to clarify their arrangement, but for now, the pretense provided the simplest explanation and the most immediate acceptance. Hours later, as winter darkness settled over Carson's mill, the cry of a newborn child pierced the quiet of Martha Simmons' boarding house. In a comfortable upstairs room, Rebecca cradled her daughter, exhausted but triumphant after the long labor. "She's perfect," Martha pronounced, finishing her ministrations with practiced efficiency. "Strong lungs, good color. You did well, especially considering your journey." Blackwood waited outside during the birth, as was proper, but now stood tentatively in the doorway at Martha's beckoning. His expression as he beheld mother and child contained a mixture of wonder and uncertainty about his place in this tableau. "Come, meet her," Rebecca invited softly. "She wouldn't be here without you." He approached cautiously, as if afraid his presence might somehow disrupt the fragile peace of the moment. When Rebecca placed the tiny bundle in his arms, his hands, so capable in the wilderness, trembled slightly. "What will you call her?" Martha asked, gathering her supplies. Rebecca hadn't allowed herself to consider names during the uncertain journey, afraid to form attachments to a future that seemed so precarious. Now, looking at Blackwood, holding her daughter with such tender care, the answer came with perfect clarity. "Hope," she said. "Her name is Hope." Later, when Martha had departed and the baby slept peacefully in a cradle borrowed from a neighbor, Rebecca and Blackwood finally had a moment alone to consider all that had transpired since that desperate day when the Sawyer party abandoned her. "Jack Carson has offered me work at the mill," Blackwood said, breaking the comfortable silence. "Says they need someone who knows the mountain passes to guide supply wagons when the snow clears." "You'd stay in town?" Rebecca asked, surprised. Given his preference for solitude, thinking about it, his gaze met hers directly. "Martha says you can work here when you're ready. She needs help with the boarding house, and there's plenty of sewing to be done." The possibilities stretched before them. No longer immediate survival, but something more enduring. A future neither had anticipated when circumstances threw them together. "They still think we're married," Rebecca observed. "Carson's mill believes I'm Mrs. Blackwood. We could make it true," he said simply, without elaborate declaration or flowery promises. "If you wanted." The proposition hung in the air between them, straightforward, honest, characteristic of the man himself. Rebecca thought of William Bennett, with his elegant words and empty promises, then of Blackwood's unwavering reliability, his actions that spoke far louder than any poetry could. "I would," she replied with equal simplicity. "Very much." Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle flakes unlike the blizzard that had both trapped them and brought them closer. Hope stirred in her cradle, a small sound that drew both their attention. In that moment, Rebecca realized the journey hadn't ended with their arrival at Carson's mill. Rather, something far more significant was just beginning. A life built not on society's expectations or gold fever dreams, but on the solid foundation of shared hardship, mutual respect, and a love that had grown not despite difficult circumstances, but because of them. The wilderness that had nearly claimed her life had instead given her a new one, unexpected, challenging, but infinitely more precious than anything she had left behind. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.